The quiet hum of a first-class cabin is a particular kind of silence, the kind money buys. And inside that silence, a soft laugh cut through the recycled air, like something sharp and small. Victoria Hale glanced sideways at the man settling into the seat beside her worn Oxford shirt, scuffed shoes that had clearly walked more miles than they were meant to, and the corners of her mouth pulled into something that wasn't quite a smile. She had built her career reading rooms, reading people, sorting them instantly into columns, useful or irrelevant. This one, she decided in under 3 seconds, belonged in the second column. She had no idea that in less than 40 minutes, at 30,000 feet, with the aircraft trembling and the cockpit in crisis, the man she dismissed without a second thought, Ethan Cole, would be the only reason any of them walked off that plane alive. Gate B-14 at Denver International was not the kind of place where a man like Ethan Cole usually stood with a boarding pass for seat 2A. He was more accustomed to the back third of the aircraft, middle seat, the kind of row where the overhead bin fills up before you arrive. But the gate agent, a young woman named Priya, who noticed the little girl holding his hand and the fatigue that lived behind his eyes, had quietly keyed in an upgrade and handed him a new boarding pass without explanation. He'd stared at it for a moment, then looked down at his daughter. Lily Cole was 8 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's tendency to observe before speaking. She had a small backpack shaped like a turtle, and she was wearing a yellow cardigan that was slightly too big, one she'd refused to let Ethan pack away despite the season. She'd been sleeping poorly for 2 weeks. The doctors in Denver had done what they could, but the specialist in Minneapolis, a pediatric cardiologist named Dr. Harmon, who had a 2-month waiting list, had an opening. Ethan had sold a piece of equipment, picked up 3 extra shifts, and booked the tickets. He had not slept more than 5 hours in any single night during the past month. He guided Lily down the jetway with one hand on her shoulder, the turtle backpack bouncing gently against her spine. She looked up at him once and asked if the seats in the front were bigger. He told her yes. She seemed satisfied with that. The cabin hit him quietly, the width of the seats, the way the light fell differently up here, the softness of things. A flight attendant named Marcus smiled and offered to take their jackets. Ethan didn't have a jacket worth taking. He thanked the man anyway and helped Lily into the window seat, tucking a small blanket around her legs the way she liked. That was when Victoria Hale arrived. She moved through the cabin the way people move when they've never had to apologize for taking up space. She was 42, with the kind of posture that comes from 20 years of board meetings and the particular confidence of someone whose face had appeared on the covers of 3 technology magazines in the past calendar year. She was the chief executive officer of Halcyon Aerospace Technologies, a company that, among other things, designed onboard diagnostic software for commercial aviation. She traveled first class the way most people breathe. Without thinking about it, she stopped at row 2, looked at the seat number, looked at Ethan. The assessment lasted less than 4 seconds, but it covered everything: the shirt, the shoes, the sleeping child, the absence of any luggage worth noting. Her eyes moved back to his face, and she offered him a smile that held all the warmth of a corporate press release. She said nothing. She didn't need to. She sat down, drew out her laptop, and made the decision that the man beside her did not merit further attention. Ethan looked straight ahead. Outside the oval window, a baggage cart rolled across the tarmac in the gray morning light. He reached over and tucked the edge of Lily's blanket more securely beneath her knee. Victoria Hale's phone calls began before the aircraft door had finished closing. She was coordinating a contract, a 9-figure partnership with a European airline consortium, and she spoke with the particular volume of someone who has never considered that her business might not be everyone else's interest. Numbers moved through the air of the first-class cabin like unwanted weather. Projected margins, integration timelines, a vendor who was, apparently, not performing to standard and would be dealt with accordingly. The flight attendant Marcus again was attentive in the way that certain passengers make necessary. He refilled Victoria's water before she asked, acknowledged her requests with a particular quality of responsiveness that Ethan recognized immediately as the economics of status. When Lily asked if she could have a second package of crackers, Marcus smiled and said he'd check. He came back with one. A man across the aisle, silver-haired, relaxed, the comfortable energy of someone who flies this way weekly, leaned slightly toward Ethan with the easy sociability of the perpetually well-traveled. He introduced himself as Douglas. He asked, in the manner of people who find silence impolite, what Ethan did for a living. Ethan considered the question without any visible discomfort. He said he drove delivery routes, nights mostly, for a logistics company out of Denver. He said it the same way he would have said anything else plainly, without apology or embellishment. Victoria's call had paused. In the brief silence, the answer traveled across the space between the seats with the clarity of something stated in a quiet room. She did not turn her head. But a sound escaped her, low, brief, shaped like amusement. "Delivery driver," she said, as though repeating something that had been said in a foreign language and needed to be confirmed. Interesting choice for first class. Douglas shifted slightly in his seat. The flight attendant found somewhere else to be. Ethan turned his head toward Victoria. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite neutral and not quite anything else, just steady. The way a man looks at something he's seen before and already made peace with. Then he turned back to the window and said nothing. Lily had her eyes open now. She looked up at her father. He touched her hand once, a small gesture, and she settled back into the blanket. The aircraft's engines climbed toward cruising pitch. Victoria returned to her call. The contract, apparently, would close by Thursday. The first sign came 40 minutes into the flight. It was not dramatic. It rarely is. The aircraft moved through a pocket of uneven air, and the passengers registered it the way passengers always do, a collective shift in attention. A brief pause in whatever they were doing, and then a return to it when nothing further occurred. Marcus came on the intercom with a measured announcement about light turbulence and the captain's recommendation to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. Ethan had not removed his seatbelt. He was not reading. He was not watching the small screen embedded in the seat ahead of him. He was listening to the aircraft the way someone listens to an engine they know not with alarm, but with attention. There was a quality to the vibration that passed through the fuselage at irregular intervals, brief and low, that existed outside the frequency of ordinary turbulence. He'd felt it twice now. He placed his hand flat on the armrest and let the metal speak to him in the way metal does when something in the system beneath it is working harder than it should. He had spent 11 years as an aerospace systems engineer with the United States Air Force. He had worked on propulsion diagnostics, avionics integration, and emergency system redundancies on 3 different aircraft platforms. He had left the work not because he wanted to, but because his wife had gotten sick, and then she had died, and someone needed to be home for Lily. He had made that choice the same way he made all his choices, quietly and without requiring anyone else to understand it. The aircraft moved again. This time, the vibration had a different character, slightly longer, slightly lower. Ethan looked at the overhead panel. The cabin pressure indicator was cycling in a way that suggested sensor communication lag, brief, possibly nothing, but noted. He looked at the wing through Lily's window. The surface was steady. The problem was not aerodynamic. Lily turned to him. "Dad, is that normal?" He looked at her yellow cardigan and thought about Dr. Harmon in Minneapolis. He thought about the appointment at 2 o'clock Thursday afternoon. He thought about the hotel with the heated pool that he'd promised her as a reward for being brave through the testing. "It's going to be fine," he said, and he meant it as a statement of intention, not a comfort. Victoria's laptop screen glowed steadily. Her fingers moved across the keyboard. She had not looked up. The second sign was harder to dismiss. 16 minutes later, the aircraft lurched not the gentle give and take of turbulent air, but a single sharp displacement, as though something in the machine had made a decision and then reconsidered it. The overhead bins rattled. A woman near the bulkhead gave a short, involuntary sound. A child, somewhere in the main cabin, began to cry. Then, the warning light appeared. It was brief, a flicker in the cabin lighting, the kind that takes 2 seconds and leaves no trace. But Ethan had seen that particular flicker before. It corresponded with a known diagnostic event, a cascade interrupt in the environmental control system. It was a pattern he had documented in a technical report nearly a decade earlier, during a review of legacy sensor architecture on a military transport platform. Victoria's hands had stopped moving on the keyboard. She was very still. A flight attendant, not Marcus, a younger woman named Claire, moved through the cabin with brisk efficiency, checking on passengers. Her smile precise and professional and slightly too controlled. She was managing the cabin the way all good flight attendants manage a cabin when they are managing themselves at the same time. Ethan watched her complete the pass. He watched her exchange a look with Marcus near the galley that she did not mean for anyone else to see. He unclipped his seatbelt. He did it quietly. He stood, and in the particular silence of a first-class cabin where everyone had already decided he was worth ignoring, the act of a delivery driver getting to his feet carried the weight of something entirely new. Victoria looked up for the first time in 20 minutes. She watched him take 2 steps toward the galley. He said, "I need to speak with the senior flight attendant." Claire told him to please return to his seat. She said it with professional firmness and a smile that did not reach her eyes. Ethan did not sit down. He spoke in a low voice, measured and direct, the voice of a man who spent years briefing officers who had very little time and no patience for anything imprecise. He told her there was a pressure imbalance developing in the cabin environmental system that the current sensor suite was almost certainly misreading as within tolerance. He told her the diagnostic pattern he had observed suggested the primary sensor array was generating false nominal data while actual cabin pressure was drifting. He told her that if the aircraft's autopilot systems were relying on those sensor readings, the flight management computer was operating on incorrect data. Claire stared at him. He said, "I'm not guessing. I know this pattern. You need to tell the captain right now." From 2 rows back, Victoria Hale's voice came with the particular edge of someone who has spent 2 decades being the smartest person in any given room. "He's guessing," she said. "He's frightening people for no reason." Ethan turned his head and looked at her. Just looked. Then he looked back at Claire. He said, "If I'm wrong, nothing changes. If I'm right, you have minutes." The cabin was very quiet. Claire looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the galley phone. Something passed between them, a decision, the kind that takes less than a second when the alternative is unthinkable. Marcus picked up the receiver. Victoria's hands were flat on the armrests now. Her laptop screen had gone to sleep. She was watching Ethan with an expression that had no name in the vocabulary she'd built over 42 years, because she had never needed a word for the moment when the person you dismissed turns out to be the only person in the room who knows what's happening. The cockpit took 2 minutes to respond to Marcus's call. Those 2 minutes were the longest in the forward cabin. The aircraft moved through another irregular displacement, longer this time, with a low oscillation beneath it that Ethan recognized as the autopilot system, making micro-corrections against data that was pulling it in the wrong direction. When the response finally came, it was not from the intercom. The cockpit door opened. The first officer stepped out. He was young, mid-30s, the build of someone who had played collegiate athletics and retained the posture, and he took 3 steps into the cabin before his hand went out and caught the back of a seat. He stood there for a moment with a particular kind of stillness. The color had left his face. Ethan moved before anyone else processed what they were seeing. He covered the distance in 4 steps, caught the first officer by the arm, and guided him into the nearest available seat. He checked the man's eyes, checked his pulse with 2 fingers against his wrist, and looked up at Marcus. "Get me the oxygen," he said. He put the mask in place. He looked at the first officer's face, which was returning slowly, the way color returns to something that has been pressed. The man looked at Ethan with eyes that had just passed through genuine disorientation and said, "The captain. Is the captain alone in there?" Ethan asked. A nod. Ethan looked at Marcus. He looked at Claire. He looked at the closed door at the end of the forward cabin. "I need emergency access authorization," he said. Right now. The question that passed through everyone in that cabin was visible on their faces. Who is this man? The answer was beginning to arrive, not yet complete, not yet fully shaped, but arriving in the way understanding always does, faster than logic and slower than instinct. Something in the way he had moved, something in the precision of what he had said, something in the complete absence of performance in everything he did. Lily was watching her father from seat 2A. She had the blanket pulled up to her chin and her turtle backpack in her lap, and she watched him with the focused calm of a child who has learned to trust a specific person without condition. She did not look frightened. She looked like she was watching someone do exactly what they were supposed to do. Victoria Hale stood up. She had not meant to. Her body had made the decision before her mind had a chance to weigh in on it. Marcus opened the cockpit door. The flight deck of a commercial aircraft is a cathedral of data. Every surface communicates. Every light, every reading, every instrument represents a layer of interpreted reality between the aircraft and the people responsible for it. Ethan stepped through the door and processed the cockpit, the way someone processes a room they know well. After a long absence, the layout familiar, the specifics new, the language the same. Captain Robert Hess was 61 years old with over 14,000 flight hours, and he was fighting. He was working the yoke with both hands and running through a checklist with the focused efficiency of a man who had trained for emergencies for 3 decades and was now living inside one. He did not look at the door. He said, without turning, "First officer down? Hypoxia. He's stable. I have him on oxygen." Hess processed this and said, "Who are you?" "Ethan Cole. Aerospace Systems Engineer, USAF, retired. I've been watching your cabin pressure pattern for the last 20 minutes. Your primary ECS sensor array is giving you false readings. Your actual cabin altitude is running about 2,000 feet higher than the display shows. Your autopilot is compensating for data that doesn't match what the aircraft is actually doing." A pause. 2 seconds. The kind of pause a man with 14,000 hours takes when someone says something that either makes no sense or makes complete sense. Hess said, "Secondary sensor reading? I didn't have access to it from the cabin, but based on the vibration pattern and the autopilot correction frequency I've been tracking, it's consistent with a cascade fault in the primary array that's contaminating the secondary cross-check. You're in a closed loop of bad data." Hess looked at the display. He looked at the secondary readout. He looked at the discrepancy between them, small. The kind of small that is easy to explain away until it isn't. He said, "Sit down." Ethan sat in the first officer's seat. In the cabin, Victoria Hale stood at the edge of the galley and watched the door that had closed behind the delivery driver from Denver. She had built a company that designed software to prevent exactly this kind of cascading sensor failure. She had signed off on integration protocols. She had presented at industry conferences. She understood, at a technical level that most people in that cabin never would, precisely how dangerous the situation was, and the only person on the aircraft who had recognized it in time was the man she had dismissed with 4 words and a laugh. She sat back down, very slowly, like something inside her was trying to figure out how to stand. The diagnosis took 9 minutes. Ethan worked through the flight management system methodically, isolating each data stream, checking the variance patterns between the primary and tertiary sensor clusters, running manual cross-comparisons, the way a mechanic runs a hand along an engine to feel what the instruments are too proud to admit. He found it in the environmental control module, a cascading fault that had started in a single pressure transducer and propagated through the sensor architecture in a pattern he had literally written a technical brief about in 2009. The transducer had been generating values that read as nominal while actual cabin pressure climbed incrementally past safe limits. The autopilot, receiving false data, had been making corrections that subtly destabilized the trim. The first officer's hypoxia was the first human symptom of something the instruments had quietly decided not to report. He disengaged the autopilot. He walked Hess through the manual reconfiguration of the pressure management system, isolating the faulty sensor cluster and switching control to the backup ECS pathway. He re-established the aircraft's trim by hand, adjusting for the corrections the autopilot had accumulated over the past 40 minutes. He contacted Minneapolis Center on the company frequency. He identified himself, explained the situation with the factual brevity of someone who has made emergency reports before, and requested priority routing and emergency services standing by at Minneapolis-St. Paul International. The controller's voice came back steady. Hess looked at him. Ethan looked back. Hess said, "What happened to your career?" It was not the question either of them expected in that moment, but it was the question that existed between them, in the space created by 11 years of distance from a skill that had just been demonstrated at 31,000 feet. "Family," Ethan said. Hess nodded once. He understood. In the cabin, Marcus had made a quiet announcement advising passengers to remain seated with seatbelts fastened. He had not specified the nature of the situation. He had used the word precautionary. But the first-class cabin was small, and people who travel first class frequently have enough experience with air travel to know what precautionary sounds like when it is not quite telling the whole truth. Victoria Hale was looking at her hands. They were shaking slightly, the fine tremor of a physiological response that status and confidence and the corner office cannot override. She was thinking about the contract she had been managing on her laptop. She was thinking about the voice in the seat beside her saying delivery driver with no edge to it at all. She was thinking about the man who was now, at this precise moment, inside the cockpit that stood between everyone on this aircraft and the ground. She was thinking, "I laughed at him." The fuel situation complicated things. 42 minutes of abnormal autopilot correction had consumed reserves at a rate inconsistent with the filed flight plan. The aircraft had enough fuel to reach Minneapolis-St. Paul comfortably under normal conditions. Under the current conditions, manual control, degraded systems, priority routing that cut time but added workload, the margin was thinner than Ethan preferred. The wind across the Minnesota approach was coming from the northwest at 27 knots, gusting to 35. This was not extraordinary. This was also not ideal for a manual approach in an aircraft whose control systems had spent the last 40 minutes in argument with their own instrumentation. Ethan had not flown a commercial aircraft since a familiarization flight in 2011, but he had 2,080 hours in military transport and tactical aircraft. He had spent 11 years understanding exactly how the systems beneath the controls interpreted the physical world, and he had the particular quality of focus that lives in a person who has already decided what matters. Lily was in seat 2A. She had a cardiology appointment on Thursday afternoon. She was wearing a yellow cardigan. She had her turtle backpack in her lap. He said to Hess, "You take the approach. I'll manage systems and call corrections." Hess said, "Agreed." In the cabin, the announcement came. The aircraft was making a precautionary landing at Minneapolis-St. Paul. Passengers should ensure their seatbelts were fastened and remain in their seats until the aircraft had come to a full stop. The cabin obeyed with the concentrated silence of people who are now, without option, trusting the outcome to forces they cannot see. Douglas, the silver-haired man across the aisle, sat with his hands folded. Claire moved through the cabin one final time, checking seatbelts, checking faces, making the small reassurances that flight attendants make when they are also making peace with things. Lily pulled the turtle backpack closer and looked out the window. The landscape below had flattened into the gray-brown geometry of late autumn Minnesota farmland. She could see a distant thread of road. She could see a water tower catching what light the clouds allowed. She said nothing. She was her father's daughter. Victoria Hale looked straight forward, at the headrest in front of her, and tried to remember the last time she had been in a situation she could not manage. She could not find one. Until now, she was thinking, his hands were steady. When he helped the first officer, when he spoke to the flight attendant, his hands were completely steady. She had not noticed, until just now, how much of her own life she had spent mistaking volume for strength. The runway at Minneapolis-St. Paul was visible through the forward windscreen at 11 miles out. Ethan called the ILS frequencies and cross-checked the glide slope data against the manual position fix. The wind was doing what the wind does over the upper Midwest in November, pressing from the left with irregular insistence, dropping off and surging in the way that keeps good pilots honest. Hess flew the aircraft with the precision of someone who has done this for 30 years. But in the last mile, with the airspeed fluctuating at the edges of the envelope and the pressure system still not fully stable, the aircraft moved twice in ways that required immediate counter-input both times. Ethan called the correction before the instruments demanded it. He was reading the aircraft directly. He was reading the air. He was working from a place that exists beyond procedure, the place that is the distillation of everything a person has spent their life learning, compressed into a single moment of necessity. The runway threshold came up. The cabin was completely silent. The aircraft sank through the last 50 feet. 30. 20. The contact with the runway was firm, harder than a standard landing, the kind that prompts gasps on commercial flights, but true. Both main gear together, the nose held off for 2 seconds, then settling. The thrust reversers came in, the brakes applied. The aircraft decelerated down the runway in the proper order, with all the force and all the physics of a machine doing exactly what it was designed to do when everything else had failed to do its part. The aircraft rolled, slowed, turned. In the cabin, no one spoke. For 4 seconds, no one spoke, and then the sound began, not organized, not a cheer exactly, more like the release of something that had been held at pressure for far too long. A sound that has no name but that everyone who has ever been frightened and then found themselves safe knows by the feeling of it in the chest. Lily unbuckled her seatbelt. She walked 5 steps forward to where Marcus had allowed Ethan to return. She put both arms around him, the way children do when they are not performing emotion but simply having it. Ethan held her. He put his face down into the top of her head, and he held her. The emergency vehicles were already on the field when the aircraft came to a stop at the isolated holding area. The first officer was transferred to paramedics. Hess walked out of the cockpit door and looked at Ethan for a long moment before extending his hand. He shook it without speaking. The handshake said everything the words didn't need to. The media arrived with the speed that media always arrives when a story has the specific gravity of this one. Within 2 hours, a passenger video had been seen by several 100,000 people, not of the flight itself, but of the gate area afterward. A man in a worn Oxford shirt standing with a small girl in a yellow cardigan, speaking to investigators, while emergency personnel moved in the background. The clip was 12 seconds long. It was enough. By evening, the details had emerged through sources within the airline and the FAA. The passenger who had diagnosed the sensor failure and provided technical support to the captain was a former United States Air Force Aerospace Systems engineer named Ethan Cole, currently employed as a delivery driver, who had been traveling with his 8-year-old daughter to a medical appointment. The story had the quality that certain stories have the quality of confirming something people already believe to be true, but rarely get to see demonstrated with this kind of clarity. Victoria Hale stood on the tarmac in the gray Minnesota afternoon, still in her coat from the flight, her phone dark in her hand. She had given a statement to the airline's crisis team. She had spoken to her communications director. She had done the things that a chief executive officer does when the world is watching. And then she walked across the held area to where Ethan was standing with Lily, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder. She stopped in front of him. She was not, in this moment, a CEO. She was not the face on 3 magazine covers. She was not the architect of a 9-figure contract or the driver of a company that employed 3,000 people. She was a woman who had laughed at someone on an airplane, and who now understood, with the particular clarity that only genuine danger provides, what that laugh had cost her. She said, "I laughed at the man who saved my life." She did not say it for the cameras. She said it quietly, to his face, in the register of something that was true and needed to be said. Ethan looked at her. His expression held no triumph. It held no resentment, no "I told you so," none of the satisfaction that the moment could have accommodated. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who is trying to do something difficult and right. He said, "Thank you for saying that." Lily stirred slightly against his shoulder. He shifted her weight without looking away. 3 days later, in a Minneapolis hotel conference room that overlooked the November River, Victoria Hale sat across a small table from Ethan Cole. Between them were 2 cups of coffee. Lily was at the children's program in the hospital 1 mile away, where Dr. Harmon had seen her on Wednesday and used words like promising and manageable and follow-up in 6 weeks. Ethan had sat in the waiting room for 4 hours with his hands folded and his eyes open, and when the doctor had come out smiling, he had thanked her twice and then gone to the window so no one would see his face. Victoria offered him a position. She framed it carefully, aware that she was negotiating with someone who did not negotiate the way she was accustomed to. "Chief Systems Analyst," she said. "Sensor Integration Review," the kind of role that a man with his background and his demonstrated judgment could shape. The kind of role that paid, she was clear about this, in a range that would mean he never drove another delivery route. Ethan listened to all of it. He thanked her. He said no. He said it without hesitation, without performance, without any evident concern for how the refusal might land in the space of the woman across the table. He said, "I already have my priority." Victoria looked at him. He said, "She has a follow-up in 6 weeks. After that, we'll see what the spring looks like." Victoria opened her mouth to respond, to argue, to reframe, to deploy the particular combination of persuasion and authority that had built her career, and then she stopped. She looked at the coffee cup between her hands. She thought about the 12 seconds of video she had watched 37 times. She thought about hands that did not shake. She said, "Can I ask you something?" He waited. "Did you apply to Halcyon after you left the Air Force?" The pause was brief, but it was there. 2014, he said. And again in 2016. Victoria was still. Not the stillness of composure. The stillness of someone absorbing something that should feel impossible but does not. She had been CEO since 2015. She had not reviewed individual hiring decisions. No CEO did. There were systems for that, carefully designed, carefully defended systems that were supposed to catch talent and route it correctly. Systems that had, twice, looked at the resume of the man who had just preserved the lives of everyone on a commercial aircraft and decided he did not qualify. She did not say anything for a long time. Outside, the river moved under the November sky, flat and gray and steady. The changes at Halcyon began the following month. Victoria did not announce them as a response to what had happened on the flight. She did not hold a press conference. She simply called her head of talent and her general counsel and told them that the company's hiring architecture needed a full structural review, not cosmetic, not a committee, a real examination of what the current systems were designed to select for and what they were designed to miss. The review found what reviews of this kind always find when someone with real authority actually wants to find it. A set of filters built to recognize a specific kind of credential, a specific kind of presentation, a specific kind of institution. Filters that processed the surface of a resume and returned a verdict before anyone had read what was underneath. Filters that had, in 2014 and again in 2016, seen a former Air Force engineer working a civilian transition job and moved on. Victoria did not apologize publicly. She did not perform the kind of corporate reckoning that becomes a press strategy. She made the changes, and she got on with the work. But she kept, in her desk drawer, a photograph that someone had taken at the gate area in Minneapolis. Ethan, in his worn Oxford shirt, Lily in her yellow cardigan, both of them caught in the gray afternoon light. His hand on her shoulder, both of them looking in the same direction. She kept it because it reminded her of something she had not had a word for before the flight, and for which she was still finding the right language. The gap between what a person appears to be and what they are. The distance between the story you tell yourself about someone in the first 3 seconds and the truth of who they are when the situation strips away everything except what they can actually do. She had spent 20 years being exceptional at her work. She had never, until that afternoon at 30,000 feet, understood what it felt like to be on the other side of someone else's competence, to need something, and have only one source for it, and to have that source be a person you had already decided wasn't worth your attention. It was an education she hadn't asked for. It was the most important one she'd ever received. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon in late December, Ethan sat in the waiting room of Dr. Harmon's office for the second time. The room had the same pale yellow walls and the same stack of children's magazines, and the same particular quality of hope that waits in the rooms where parents sit while strangers look at their children's hearts. He had Lily's turtle backpack in his lap. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. A Minneapolis area code he didn't recognize. He answered. It was Victoria. She asked how Lily was doing. He told her they were waiting for the follow-up results. She said she hoped it was good news. He said he thought it would be. Then she said, I changed the system. He said, I know. I read about it. A pause. The kind of pause that exists between two people who have been through something together that most people never go through, and who are still figuring out what the language is for what they now are to each other. She said, if you ever want to talk about what comes after, I'm here. He said, I appreciate that. The door to the examination suite opened. Dr. Harmon came out with her clipboard and her practiced expression of measured optimism, and her face as she looked at Ethan carried something warmer than optimism. She said, let's talk about Lily. He stood up. He said into the phone, briefly. Victoria said, of course, go. He went. Real worth doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with credentials pressed and visible, with the right labels or the right address or the right chair on the right aircraft. It waits. It watches. It does the work that needs doing without requiring anyone to notice. And sometimes, when the instruments fail and the data lies and the sky becomes the place where everything that was certain stops being certain sometimes, in those specific, irreplaceable moments, the only thing standing between what is and what could have been is a person that someone, somewhere, decided wasn't worth a second look. The value of a person is not what they're wearing when they board. It's what they do when everything falls apart.